Hello ladies, welcome to Homemakers Radio. Hope you get a lot done while you listen today. We're going to do a little bit of everything from getting dressed, getting prepared, a little homemaking, and then some of the more interesting things. I might even homeschool you a little bit. Just think, when you're finished with all the things I have to say, you can legitimately say you were homeschooled. So one of the things that I like to do is compare it to the way that I was educated because I find it so different and so fascinating. And I always like to leave you on a high note, so I'll try not to tell you too much bad news. And so if you have something to do and it's a little tedious and you've had a little hard time getting started, maybe this will help you. But before you go and get ready, I want to share with you my teacup. And this is a beautiful cup that I got at HomeGoods. And I haven't used it yet actually, but I liked it so much and it was so inexpensive. It has a bit of gold on it, and I like the bowl shape cups. Now some people don't. They prefer more of something that would hold a little more tea and not let it cool so quickly, but I like these kind. And so I thought that was nice. And today I'm just wearing one of the dresses that have been hanging in my closet for so many years, waiting to go somewhere more important, and I decided to wear it to visit you today. And it's just got a little Spencer lace jacket on it, and it's a little sleeveless dress, and I don't have anywhere to wear it, and the queen is not coming, so I decided to wear it for you. So the first thing that we do, I also want to say that if you have found me on the internet, I am making these for my site, my website, my blog, and so I don't have any comments here on the YouTube channel, but you can watch this in this nice atmosphere of the Home Living blog and enjoy listening to it there, and leave a comment if you like. And so I appreciate everything you've all done for me. I really am so honored that you've come to listen, and I hope you get a lot out of it. And this is just a sharing of my opinion and my experience, so don't try to copy or emulate everything that I say or do, because everybody has their own home and their own family with different needs. But I thought that maybe it would keep you company while you did something at home. So if you've got something to fold or load or unload or sort through or clean, and some people say they just use it while they exercise. So you can go ahead and do that, because I don't have anything else to show you. I will be reading a few things from books for you today, and I have contacted Miss Lily of the Valley, and she has agreed to a longer story, and I understand she's now making end papers inside of her little books because she knows that I like them. And so I will be showing you that, and not today but another day. And so thank you for your suggestion. So now the routine is you get dressed. And the reason for that is, I'm sure you can think that at home, well, does it matter? Because probably it's not required and no one's going to see you. But you know, you can do a lot better when you're dressed. And back in the 1960s, when some men were developing their businesses in their basements or their little home office, they found that if they dressed up and wore a button-down shirt and you know, presented themselves to themselves in their own little office, that they just were so much more efficient. They contacted more people, and they made a little more money, and they just did a better job. And so I want to be sure that you know that getting dressed is going to help you be more efficient. I would like to read you a verse from the Bible. I was starting it out with by wisdom a house is built, but I've got a bit of a different one for you today, okay? And that comes from Colossians 3, verse 23 and 24. I'll try to post that for you too. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward, for you serve the Lord Christ. Now this was written to bondservants in the book of Colossians, and bondservants were people who were, I guess, sent to work for someone to pay off a debt. And in a way, is a servant, and in a way I think homemakers can identify with it because you're working for everybody else. You're trying to help your family learn your routine and take some responsibility, but basically it's you that has to do it all, and even if you do have help, and you have to have a higher cause, because if you just do it for people around you, they can mess it up for you, and they can also sometimes make you a little bit discouraged, because of course the woman's work at home is never really completely done. But I love this idea of doing it. This was to help servants to actually win the people that they were working for by realizing they weren't really just serving these people, they were serving the Lord by their work. And when you have that higher calling, everything just has a bit more sparkle to it. It's just a bit more glorious. It's just you're not doing it to please other people, because you can't always get, excuse the noise here, there's so many tractors going by, and they're seeding the ground and they're plowing it up. What a noisy place it is. In fact, if you think the country is peaceful, you need to come out here. All you hear all day long is donkeys braying and tractors going and roosters crowing. Of course, now I know that everyone is raising chickens in their own backyard. You'll hear roosters all the time and hens clucking. So it's just going to be noisy. So whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, you knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward, for you serve the Lord Christ. Isn't that wonderful? And when you think of it, it was also a better way to win others, to win their cooperation, and to win them to the higher calling of Christ. So that's the best that I can explain that, but I just am always so inspired by that scripture, because you can't depend on other people to approve of you, or to promote you, or to give all of your work to, because they sometimes can ruin it for you, and their attitudes might not always be what you want them to be. So it's better to serve the Lord. So now, the idea of getting dressed first thing can be a bit daunting if you're used to just getting out of bed and you're running around in your pajamas, getting a lot done, and then finally getting dressed or getting your shower at last. But the reason for being dressed first is that for some reason the preparation that you make can also be a doorway to preparing your schedule and preparing yourself for other things. It lightens you, it lifts you. It also gives you a feeling that you're working in a very important place, that this is more like a castle or something like that, that a place you may never go, but you can evoke the feeling of it by dressing for it. Now, I wouldn't wear this fancy dress to do housework in unless I wore an apron over it, but I just changed for you because I had been out working in the garden and I needed to change, and I have not been here for 5 days, and I keep thinking I'm going to get around to this, but right now is planting time, and we always want to get everything in while we can, and we're getting some rain too. You want to get those seeds in and get the rain afterwards, and it's an anxious thing to worry that it's going to rain before you get the seeds in. And what I like about the rain is I don't have to water. I don't have to turn the water on and arrange the sprinklers, and so I haven't been here for 5 days because I've been busy pulling up grass and weeds and preparing the land for things that I wanted to plant. Now, I want to say that when you get dressed, you need to not hurry. And that is one of the beauties of being home and being a homemaker, is that you do have some time limitations, but when you know you're not in a hurry, then your mind can catch up to what you're doing. And how many times have you rushed out the door and you just didn't even think about what you were wearing because you had your mind on the road ahead or the place that you had to go? But when you are getting dressed and you're teaching your children to dress, their minds have time to catch up to what they're doing. Think about that. When you are in the car going somewhere and you've seen a lot of things, it takes a while for it to sink in. It takes a while for your mind to catch up in. I always think of the Bennetts going, Elizabeth Bennet going to see Pemberley, and she was in the coach with her aunt, and I was thinking about how leisurely the carriage went past the lakes, the lake country of England, and how it's just a movie, it's just a story, but how her thoughts had time to settle and to think about what she was looking at. Whereas when we travel, it's so fast, we barely have time. You might see something. Now, Mr. S is really good, because if I see something and I want to have a picture of it or look at it more carefully, he'll actually stop the car, turn around, and go back for miles just to let me see it. So I have to be careful what I say, because he might just turn around and take off the other direction just because I like to see it, or he thought I liked it. But it is because it is so fast, and this is one reason why I hope that the train travel becomes more popular, because it's a little slower and you can see the scenery as you go past. I don't think the trains actually go very fast through some of the countrysides, and I really like to see that come back and give us a chance to slow down and give us a chance to see the scenery. Now, costume is so important. I am going to wear a costume when I next do a pioneer story, when I read that. But one of the things that will help you learn how to dress and feel is to get a costume and wear it. And then you get a feeling of how clothing is supposed to sit on you and how you're supposed to feel it, because it just gives you a feeling of the cloth and the drape and just the elegance sense that it gives you. And if you're having trouble knowing what to wear and knowing how clothing is supposed to feel on you, start out with a costume, and then you'll get a sense of how to choose clothing. There's just something interesting about that. And costume wearing is something completely different. It makes you feel very put together, very purposeful. There's something so totally different about it, and than the commercial clothes that are sold today. So if you want to get a feeling of how clothing can make you feel, and then choose a costume, find a costume, or make one, or I would really rather have, sew one myself, because I can make it fit. But you can find costumes that are like pioneer costumes or Victorian costumes or other type of costumes that give you a feeling, I guess, for the home, by the way, because women used to be home-based, mostly home-based. Very few women had to go anywhere to work, but their home was their work, and they gave work assignments to any hired help that they had. But it was so different than it is today. I think today, with people rushing about, the home just gets a lick and a promise, and you just kind of make do. But wearing a costume kind of gives you a motivation. I'm not suggesting that everyone wear a costume every day, but I have noticed the effect, and I wanted to share that idea with you. So now I wanted to just discuss, while you're homemaking, go ahead and at least, if you're dressed and you have an apron on, at least get the kitchen cleaned up. That seems to be the most daunting thing, but if you can get that out of there, that'll make the house smell better. And then while you might put in a load of laundry while you're that will be going while you're doing that, and get your dishwasher unloaded and loaded, and get the surface areas around cleaned up and wiped down, and everything looking sparkling nice, and sweep the floor. Once you get out of the kitchen, it seems like if the kitchen is cleaned up, you have a little bit more positive energy for the rest of the house. So if you can get that cleaned up, that's your main hurdle. And then, of course, your other things that you have listed that are basic, and basic things are the bathroom and the kitchen and the laundry, and other things can be secondary. Now, I think that everyone should take a little time, sit down with their teacup and a notepad, and make a list. Don't look at my list, it's very messy. And because then your mind will have a chance to focus on what you're supposed to be doing. And I talked about your mind catching up to things. That's a very good way to do it, is to make your list. You don't have to make a schedule. I couldn't live with a schedule, because if it said 11:30 to 12 o'clock, clean the kitchen, and I didn't quite make it, and it was 1 o'clock before I got finished, it would frustrate me. So I just make the list. I don't put the time with it. You can put the time if you think you can manage that. That always discouraged me, but it might work for you, and I hope so. Now, I was thinking today a little bit about how the news, I've warned you about feeding too much on it, because it's not the homemaker's nutrition. The news just will not work for homemaking, because it's discouraging, and it will make you feel so unsettled and upset and unfocused. And how many times have you wished, if you're an older woman, how many times have you wished that you had not paid attention to the news of your day, and that you'd paid attention to your family, to your children, to the needs of the house, and the needs of your husband, or the needs that were upon you, things that you needed to do. And so don't pay too much attention, because in a couple of years, all the recent news, the hype that's going on, will be gone, and they will think of something else to keep you continually unsettled. And that is, you don't even have to be a prophet to know that, because after this one, there will be something else. And they make a lot of it up, and they plan it. They don't ever really report real news that happens around here or in your vicinity. They have it all planned, and they film it, and then they play it over and over and over, and get you so upset that you think it's the end of the world, and then you don't concentrate on the beautiful life of your home. So today I wanted to tell you that that is one of the reasons that your home has to be a settled place, and a place where there is some routine and something that you can count on that's going to happen. You can count on your meals. You can count on getting dressed. You can count on, I'm going to do the dishes today. And so if you need to listen to something besides me, please don't listen to the news, because it's like a soap opera. In fact, I call it the news narcissist. A narcissist is someone who finds out something that will upset somebody and do that, or find out something that makes you happy and take it away from you, make you unhappy. Find out something that makes you feel stable and destabilize you. That's a narcissist. So I call the news narcissist. And so if you need to listen to something, there are so many nice things to listen to, and you can listen to something that will build you up. And of course, you know, I like to put in a favorite DVD and let that play in the background. It's usually something from the period movies, you know, of the 1990s that I liked so much, and other ones too. And I have a list of things that I really like. And so the names of things, I have that written down, because when you are in your home a lot, I think names are really, really important. And the other day, I don't have it here with me, but the other day someone gave me 2 little tea lights, and the scent on one was Morning Dew, and the scent on the other one was named Deep Lake. And oh my goodness, the Morning Dew just smelled like Morning Dew. I don't know how they get these scents too, or it could be just when you read the name of it, then it gets in your mind, that's what Morning Dew smells like. I don't know, but it was fresh. It was just beautiful. And I don't light these things anymore. I either put them on a little warmer, or just leave them in a cabinet so that they scent the cabinet. And the other one was Deep Lake, and it did feel like going to a little lake vacation spot, just a quiet little place. I thought that was interesting. And I like the names of things. And I was thinking the other day how I had been way back in the 1980s, I had been to a bed and breakfast inn, and how impressed I was that the names were on the doors of family members' names were on these doors from the 1800s because it was a historical home, and the names were on all of the doors, so every room had a name, and I just thought that was so interesting. And then she had also other rooms which she called by flowers, like the rose room, and other names were the names of the seasons, like summer room, autumn room, and they were all decorated to go with the name. And I thought how interesting that would be to name your own rooms and your own areas in your house. And I also had a friend that made, I'm just talking about names right now. I'm fascinated with names because of the interesting things. At the end of the bolt of fabric at any fabric store, where there's the description of the fabric and the cost, will be the name of it. And there's China Blue, and there's Coming Up Roses, and there's Rose Garden, and there's all kinds of like carnation. And I just think it's so interesting to see names of things. It tickles me so that it's not just plain red, blue, or yellow. It's got a name that gives a mood to it. I love names. And so I knew a lady who named, she sewed dresses. They were just dresses from the 1980s, and she named each dress. I can't remember all the names she had, but she had a little tag she put on the inside, and she would name it the name of a person, or she would call it the beach cottage dress, or she would call it I think they were just called cottage dresses. I thought that was interesting. So I just thought names are fun. And the other day, speaking of names, I've often thought there were more seasons than just the 4 seasons, because I think each season has a high season and a low season within that season. So instead of 4 seasons, there's probably 8 seasons, and there might even be more. But the other day, it rained terribly here, and I had to go somewhere, and I waited until it subsided a little bit and got in my car and drove down the country roads and noticed that it was still real dark and gloomy, and the rocks on the side of the road were all very blackened by this rain. They were just dark, and the field was very dark, but everything was damp. And I thought there must be a name for the after the rain. There has to be a scent of after the rain. And there has to be a pie you can make called after the rain pie. I have no idea what it would be. And there has to be a dress you could make, or an umbrella you could have that called after the rain. Because it was still kind of misting. And I was just thinking of that because of names, the names of things. Now, I told you in the last video that there were several gardens in the Bible, and I named 3 of them. And one was the Garden of Eden, and then there's the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and there was the Garden of Gethsemane. And so names are just so interesting. And when you're doing your housework, when you're going around routine things, these are things that you can think about. Names and the importance of a name, because a name is very descriptive. Now, I have today a book, several things to read to you, and one of them is from a book called Of America Volume 2, but you can get things like this in other books. This is part of the homeschooling series that I've been doing, and I thought that you might like me to read this because it's about character. And you can order books on character, or you can write your own by reading the book of Proverbs to learn about character, or summarizing the characters, the people in the Bible, and what their character strengths and weaknesses were. You can go through all the women and men of the Bible and find out what they were and teach them or learn them. So this is called Companions, and I don't know what year this was written, but it looks like it was an older, maybe something from the 1920s or the late 1800s, I don't know. But it starts out with a quote by George Washington. And it says, associate with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. We have thought of that a lot, because if you're a homemaker, it can be so isolating. I don't really think, I know everyone thinks it's lonely, but it's actually more isolating than lonely, because you can be isolated and not lonely because you're so absorbed in what you're doing. And so you think about that. It's better to be alone than to be in bad company. And sometimes longing for companionship and company can get you in more trouble because it's a time waster and you can't get anything done. And while it's nice to have someone to talk to, it doesn't always go with what you're doing, and they can slow you down. So I'd like to read this to you. It's called Companions. Good for young and old alike. Companions whom one has deliberately chosen may make or mar character. Those of whom we approve, with whom we choose to live in daily friendships, are one of the determining factors in our lives. If one chooses to remain in close companionship with the vulgar and the mean, he cannot keep himself pure in heart. He will listen to things that besmirch. At first will listen, resenting what he hears. Then, as the days pass, accepting it, and after a while repeating it. You know, this is so true, especially if you're a homemaker, or you've maybe even been a homeschooler. You maybe get around someone who is very sarcastic and doesn't approve of what you're doing, and they think that you're too strict, or maybe they call you conceited because you don't want to participate in the way that they speak or their attitudes. You get around them, and after a while you start to tolerate it a little bit more and become at ease with it, and then you start to listen, and then at first you won't like it, you'll resent it, but the more you're around it, you get used to it and you start to tolerate it. And then as the days pass, you accept it, and after a while you may even repeat it. It could be any kind of attitude, it could be any kind of thing that is said, maybe about the church or about your family. I don't know how many of you have ever had your own family run down by people who think that you guys are just a bunch of hypocrites, and they'll run you down, and after a while you start to think, oh, maybe we are like that, And while it's good to have some self-examination, we have to be careful of the people we're around if they're doing that, and what effect it has on us. It'll especially ruin your attitude towards homemaking, because it's somehow people that criticize know that it takes away your determination and your purpose. And so if the proposals of his companions for good times and a lark, at first that word a lark makes me think that this was probably written in the 1920s. Don't quite know when that expression first came out, but it doesn't seem like it was something from the 1800s. At first meet with disapproval, then with a reluctant consent, and he continues to remain with them, the reluctance will slowly change to a willing consent. See, that's how the news media does you. You get, if you haven't had television in a long time, and then you're somewhere where there's a television and you hear it, at first it really rattles you. You don't like it, but you get used to it after a while, and then pretty soon it doesn't bother you. Finally, he will propose larks of the same sort or worse himself. This is the law. We become like the thing in which we choose habitually to associate. And this is the same with children. They'll become like the people they are around the most, and that's why we recommend that you bring them up in the home and teach them at home if you can, because you might not have the confidence and you might not think that you're very nice people, but if you've ever been around people who are constantly critical and who are constantly running down the home, the church, the nation, this is not good. This is not good for children either, because they will grow up thinking they are very, very inferior, that they live in an inferior place, that their family is inferior, that the church is inferior, and that God is not important. If you find that you are critical, fault-finding, continually complaining of your work and your lot in life, if you use a great deal of slang, are accused of being rude in speech and in manner, note your companions. You know, you might not have friends, but you might have a television set, and you might be listening a lot to something that is not very edifying and does not improve your character. In 9 cases out of 10, you will find that these are their faults too. So it will be like the people we are around the most. If our companions are purer, finer, more noble than we, though at first we may follow them afar off, yet if we choose to continue the close association until the companionship ripens into friendship, we shall grow to be like them. Okay, let's say we are alone a lot, but you know, we do have a lot of things we can listen to. We can listen to the Bible online, we can listen to good people online, we can listen to good stories and good things. And so I wanted to explain why I liked this book. It was called Old World History and Geography. And the reason that I liked it was not that I thought that it was completely accurate in everything, but if you stand back and look at the whole idea of it, it shows history in a different perspective than the ones that we grew up with. It isn't scary. It isn't a threat. It shows how people who have followed God's way, what the consequences are compared to people who are destructive or people who are not good leaders. And it shows history and the things that happened over time. And I wanted to bring out this one part. It's from a Christian perspective. It's a totally different attitude, and it just settles you a little bit. It settles you to know that there's a Christian view of it, of history. Now, like I say, not everything can be taken as total truth, because it's just a guide. It's just a book, and there will be maybe a slight, you might see that they will promote Christianity in a different way than you would think of it, and they will promote maybe people who you've never heard of and say that they were a great preacher or minister, but the whole idea is to honor those who speak God's word. And so there is a whole thing here about the spread of the gospel with the Apostle Paul, which was pretty good. It says he preached the gospel in many cities in Asia Minor and Greece, and he even sailed as far west as Rome. Many became Christians, and God used Paul and other apostles to write the books of the New Testament. Christians went all over the known world to preach the gospel and teach the truths of the Bible. Now, the known world at that time, I guess, included as far north as Spain, but some people say, we have another history book that we combined with this that showed how people from Galatia went clear up to, I believe it was Ireland. I don't know what it was called at the time. And so the gospel was spread in the known world, and some of those places were actually known, especially in the European area. But when we get to the story about Queen Victoria, and talks about the era and the things that were written. Remember I was talking about classics, and how you have to be careful and why things were named classics, and classic books that were actually called classics, but they weren't all that great, and they didn't have good principles in them. And so this talks about Queen Victoria and how she said, first, let me go back to the textile industry, because this is during the time of Elizabeth Gaskell, when she wrote North and South about the textile industry, about the cotton mills in northern part of England. And so I wanted to read a little bit about the textile industry in the Victorian era, Queen Victoria's lifetime. The textile industry. For many years, the production of textiles, cloth, had been important in England, but it had always been done with slow-moving spinning wheels and hand-operated looms. Inventive Englishmen went to work to create machines that would bring out faster and more efficient production. The flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, and the power loom all helped to speed up the process and give jobs to other people. Once James Watt of Scotland had perfected the steam engine, the textile factories had all the power they needed and production greatly increased. Sometimes I see a scene in North and South where the steam was all around the train and thinking, wouldn't that be nice if we had steam engines? So here's some other progressive things that this history book talks about. A lot of history books don't tell about things like this. It says Englishmen now went to work solving other problems. They found an inexpensive way to change iron into steel and better and safer ways to work in coal mines. They dug canals, built better ships, laid railroads, and before long they were making use of such American inventions as the steamship and the telegraph. Cities grew along with the factories, and many new cities sprang up in England. England began to increase its trade with other countries to get more raw materials to refine in the factories. Raw materials are natural resources that can be used for producing other goods. Some raw materials are cotton, which can be turned into cloth, iron, which can be changed to steel, clay, which can be used for making china, and milk, which can be turned into cheese. Now, it talks about the Victorian age, and it says, childhood resolution. Now, this gives you a different perspective of Queen Victoria, and why shouldn't we have a different perspective? Because some of the history books that were written by the state or the government or the state schools do not always show all aspects and perspectives of people. When Queen Victoria was just a girl, she realized that she would probably be the next Queen of England. Her father and uncle had ruled poorly because they were disobedient to God's moral laws. Princess Victoria determined that she would not follow their example. I will be good, she resolved when she was 11 years old. When she was just 18, she became queen. And through her long life, she kept her childhood resolve, and England reaped the blessings of having a righteous ruler. Now, I had a book that showed several entries in her diaries about going to church and what she heard and what the minister had said when she was on holiday in Scotland. They had a house in Scotland. Was that Balmoral? Not sure. And she wrote how she went to Kirk and how the minister had talked about living a life, a selfless life, and several entries. And I believe the name of the book was called My Heart Sings, and this woman had filled this book full of inspiring passages from books, diaries, and sayings from artists and writers. And Queen Victoria, there were 2 entries in that book talking about her experience in church and how she felt that when she left the church, she felt like she was going to live, she was inspired to live a better life and to think better thoughts. I thought that was interesting. And so the Bible says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. Proverbs 29:2. And righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14:34. Queen Victoria was so beloved by her subjects that British people ever since have looked back to her reign with respect and pride. The years of her rule are called the Victorian Age in her honor. It doesn't have a date here, but I understand it ended in 1903, the year that she died. But she was queen for so long, 75 years, that the British couldn't remember. There was no one alive that could remember how to do a coronation. So then it talked about Victorian literature, and here's where it falls off my expectations a little bit. And that's why you can't take, I know there's a little, there's questions at the end of the chapters, but I don't take any of them seriously, and because I always had my own questions, and it was Victorian literature. Now, I mentioned that Elizabeth Gaskell was not included. Her books were not included in any of the Victorian literature, partly because Elizabeth Gaskell didn't like sensationalism, so her books were not sensational. And they didn't have the sadness and the horror of some of the modern novels of the time, which she didn't like. So, of course, they weren't widely published, and in my opinion, they're a classic, just like anything else, in fact, better, and should have been included as classics in the colleges and in the universities. It would certainly have reaped better character in people instead of people who came out depressed and despairing. But Victorian literature, many excellent books were written during the Victorian age. Robert Browning and Alfred Lord Tennyson were two famous poets. Charles Dickens wrote many short stories and novels that are still enjoyed today, including A Christmas Carol and David Copperfield. Rudyard Kipling wrote stories set in many interesting colonies of the British Empire, including the children's classic The Jungle Book. Now, they didn't include Elizabeth Gaskell, and they didn't include Jane Austen, and this should have been included. They were from the era, but because they were not considered great because there wasn't a lot of drama in it. It was mostly household drama, and so I was going to read a little bit out of Wives and Daughters for you today. And it's very, very valuable to have seen the videos first, because they you can see the scene in your mind better. Like I say, a lot of these authors from the 1800s were very, very wordy, long sentences, and it's hard to grasp the scene. But if you see the movie, they really did a very good job imitating this, and they left out some of the harder passages that would have made it more tedious. I'm going to read this to you because this is the part of the movie, of the story, Elizabeth Gaskell's Wives and Daughters, where Mr. Gibson has already proposed to Claire, or Hyacinth, and she has accepted, and now he's going to get married. So he comes to where Molly is. She's been staying with the Hamleys to help Mrs. Hamley. Mrs. Hamley doesn't feel well and has been chronically sick for a long time. And so her papa comes and tells her about it, and her reaction is not very good. And then Roger steps in later on when he finds her so upset, and tries to tell her to look on the bright side. And none of us like it when we're upset. If somebody comes along and says, "Be happy, look on the bright side," we're not in the mood for that. I thought that was an interesting part. So I'll read this to you. And so, "Molly, my dear, Papa, I didn't know you were at home." Let me see if I can find this. I'll start over here. This is where he tells her he's going to get married. He's a little bit nervous about it. And they talk about someone else that wasn't included in the movie named Miss Eyre, but I think that was changed in the movie so that you wouldn't get mixed up with another character in another novel. But so he said, oppressed with the heat, she had fallen asleep in an easy chair. Remember, she's staying with the Hamleys. She had fallen asleep in an easy chair, her bonnet and open book upon her knee, one arm hanging listlessly down. She looked very soft and young and childlike, and a gush of love sprang into her father's heart as he gazed at her. "Molly," he said gently, taking the little brown hand that was hanging down and holding it in his own. "Molly." She opened her eyes, for that one moment had no recognition in them. Then the light came brilliantly into them, and she sprang up and threw her arms around his neck, exclaiming, "Oh, Papa, my dear Papa, what made you come while I was asleep? I lose the pleasure of watching for you." Mr. Gibson turned a little paler. than he had been before. He still held her hand, and drew her to a seat beside him on the sofa, without speaking. There was no need. She was chattering away. "I was up so early. It's charming to be out here in the fresh morning air. I think that made me sleepy. But isn't it a gloriously hot day? I wonder if the Italian skies they talk about can be any bluer than that little bit you see just between the oaks, over there." She pulled her hand away, and used both it and the other to turn her father's head so that he could see exactly the very bit she was talking about. She was rather struck by his unusual silence. Have you heard from Miss Eyre, Papa? How are they?" I'm sure she's talking about the Miss Brownings. "How are they all? And this fever that is about? Do you know, Papa? I don't think you're looking very well. You want me at home to take care of you. How soon may I come home?" "Don't I look well? That must be all your fancy, Goosey. I feel uncommonly well, and I ought to look well, for I have a piece of news for you, little woman." He felt that he was doing his business very awkwardly, but he was determined to plunge on. "Can you guess it?" "Well, how should I?" said she, but her tone was changed, and she was evidently uneasy. "Why, you see, my love," he said, again taking her hand, "that you are in a very awkward position. A girl growing up in such a family as mine, young men, which was a piece of confounded stupidity on my part, and I am obliged to be away so much. But there is Miss Eyre. I'm sure she was talking about Miss Browning. I think they changed that," said she, sick with the strengthening, indefinite presage of what was to come. "Still, there are times like the present when they cannot be with you. Their home is not with us. They have other duties. I've been in great perplexity for some time, but at last I've taken a step which will, I hope, make us both happier." "You're going to be married again," she said, helping him out with a quiet, dry voice, and gently drawing her hand out of his. They did a very good job on that scene. "Yes, to Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Do you remember her? They call her Claire at the Towers. You recollect how kind she was to you the day that you were left there." She did not answer. She could not tell what words to use. She was afraid of saying anything, lest the passion of anger, dislike, indignation, whatever it was that was boiling up in her, could find a vent in cries and screams, or worse, in raging words that would never be forgotten. It was as if the piece of solid ground on which she stood had been broken from the shore, and she was drifting out to the infinite sea alone. Mr. Gibson saw that her silence was unnatural, and half guessed at the cause of it, but he knew that she must have time to reconcile herself to the idea, and still believed that it would be for her eventual happiness. He had, besides, the relief of feeling that the secret was told, the confidence was made, which he had been dreading for the last 24 hours. He went on recapitulating all the advantages of their marriage. He knew them by heart by now. "She's a very suitable age for me. I don't know how old she is exactly, but she must be nearly 40. I shouldn't have wished to marry anyone younger. She's highly respected by Lord and Lady Cumnor and their family, which of itself is a character. She has very agreeable and polished manners, of course from the circle she has been thrown into, and you and I, Goosey, are apt to be a little brusque, or so we must brush up on our manners now." No remark from her on this little bit of playfulness. He went on. "She has been accustomed to housekeeping, economical housekeeping, too, for of late years she has had a school at Ashcombe, and she has, of course, to arrange all things for a large family. And last but not least, she has a daughter about your age, Molly, who of course will come and live with us, and be a nice companion, a sister for you." Still she was silent. At length she said, "So I was sent out of the house, that all this might be quietly arranged in my absence." Out of the bitterness of her heart she spoke, but she was roused out of her assumed impassiveness by the effect produced. Her father started up and quickly left the room, saying something to himself, what she could not hear, though she ran after him. followed him through dark stone passages into the glare of the stable yard, into the stables. "Oh, Papa, Papa, I'm not myself. I don't know what to say about this hateful, detestable—" He led his horse out. She did not know if he heard her word. Just as he mounted, he turned around upon her with a gray, grim face. "I think it's better for both of us for me to go away now. We may say things difficult to forget. We are both much agitated. By tomorrow we shall be more composed. You will have thought it over, and seen the principle. One great motive, I mean, was your good. You may tell Mrs. Hamley. I meant to have told her myself. I will come again tomorrow. Good-bye, Molly." For many minutes after he had ridden away, long after the sound of his horse's hoofs on the round stones of the paved lane beyond the home meadows had died away, Molly stood there, shading her eyes, and looking at the empty space of air in which his form at last appeared. Her very breath seemed suspended. Only 2 or 3 times, after long intervals, she drew a miserable sigh, which was caught into a sob. She turned away at last, but could not go into the house, could not tell Mrs. Hamley, and could not forget how her father had looked and spoken and left her. She went out through the side door. It was the way by which the gardeners passed when they took the manure into the garden, and the walk to which it had been concealed from sight as much as possible by shrubs and evergreens and overarching trees. No one would know what had become of her, and with the ingratitude of misery, she added to herself, no one would care. Mrs. Hamley had her own husband, her own children, her own home interests. She was very good and kind. But there was a bitter grief in Molly's heart, with which the stranger could not intermeddle. She went quickly on to the burn which she had fixed for herself, a seat almost surrounded by the drooping leaves of a weeping ash, a seat on the long, broad terrace walk of the other side of the wood that overlooked the pleasant slope of the meadow beyond. The walk had probably been made to command the sunny, peaceful landscape, with trees and church spire, 2 or 3 red-tiled roofs of old cottages. When she once got to the seat, she broke out with suppressed passion of grief. She did not care to analyze the sources of her tears and sobs. Her father was going to be married again. Her father was angry with her, and she had done very wrong. He had gone away displeased, and she had lost her love. He was going to be married, away from her, away from his child, his little daughter, forgetting her own dear mother. So she thought in a tumultuous kind of way, sobbing till she wearied herself out, and had to gain strength by being quiet for a time, to break forth into her passion of fresh tears. She had cast herself on the ground, that natural throne for violent sorrow, and leant up against the old moss-grown seat, sometimes burying her face in her hands, sometimes clasping them together, as if by the tight, painful grasp of her fingers she could deaden the mental suffering. See how wordy they are. She did not see Roger Hamley returning from the meadows, nor hear the click of the little white gate. He had been out dredging in ponds and ditches, and he had a wet sling net with its imprisoned treasures over his shoulders. He was coming home to lunch, having always a fine midday appetite, though he pretended to despise the meal in theory. But he knew that his mother liked his companionship then. She depended much upon her luncheon, and was seldom downstairs and visible to her family much before the time. So he overcame his theory for the sake of his mother, and had his reward in the hearty relish with which he kept her company in eating. He did not see Molly as he crossed the terrace walk across the way home. He had gone about 20 yards along the small wood path at right angles to the terrace, when, looking among the grasses and wild plants under the trees, he spied out one which was rare, one which he had, remember he was a nature scientist, one which he had long been wishing to find in a flower, and saw it at last with those bright, keen eyes of his. Down with his net, skillfully twisted so as to retain its contents, while he lay amid the herbage, and he himself went with light and well-planted footsteps in search of the treasure. He was so great a lover of nature that without any thought, but habitually, he was always avoiding treading unnecessarily on any plant, who knew what long-sought growth or insect might develop itself in that which now appeared. His steps led him in the direction of the ash tree seat, much less screened from observation on this side of the terrace. He stopped. He saw a light-colored dress on the ground, somebody half lying on the seat, so just then he wondered if the person, whoever it was, had fallen ill. He paused to watch. In a minute or two the sobs broke out. The words, it was Miss Gibson, crying in a broken voice. "Oh, Papa, Papa, if you would only come back." For a minute or two he thought it would be kinder just to leave her, fancying herself unobserved. He had even made a retrograde step or two on a tiptoe, but then he heard the miserable sobbing again. It was farther than his mother could walk, or else, be the sorrow what it would, she would be the natural comforter of this girl, her visitor. However, whether it was right or wrong, delicate or obtrusive, when he heard the sad voice talking again in such tones of uncomforted, lonely misery, he turned back, and went to the green tent under the ash tree. She started up when he came close to her. She tried to check her sobs. She wiped her eyes, and instinctively smoothed her wet, tangled hair back with her hands. He looked down on her with grave, kind sympathy, but he did not know exactly what to say. "Is it lunch-time?" said she, trying to believe that he did not see the traces of her tears and the disturbance of her features. "I don't know. I was going home for lunch, but you must let me say it. I wouldn't go on when I saw your distress. Has anything happened? Anything in any way I can help? I mean, for, of course, I have no right to make inquiry, if it's a private sorrow in which I can be of no use." She had exhausted herself with so much crying that she felt as if she could neither stand nor walk just yet. She sat down on the seat and sighed and turned so pale he thought she was going to faint. "Wait a moment," she said, quite unnecessarily, for she could not have stirred. He was off like a shot to bring some water that he knew would be in the wood, and in a minute or two he returned with careful steps, bringing her in a little broad green leaf, turned into an impromptu cup. Little as it was, it did her good. Did you ever do that? Put water in a little leaf and drink it? It sounds like something we would have done when we were kids. "Thank you," she said. I can walk back now, in a short time. Don't stop." "You must let me," he said. "My mother wouldn't like me to leave you here when you're so faint." So they remained in silence for a little while, he breaking off and examining one or two abnormal leaves in the ash tree. "Papa is going to be married again," she said at length. "And you're sorry for it," he said. She did not take her eyes away from his. "Yes," she said. He was silent again, looking at the ground. His thoughts did not come readily to the surface in the shape of words. "It seems there might be cases," he said at last, setting the question of love entirely on one side. "This is the step may be greatly for your father's happiness, but for yours also. It may relieve him from many cares, and may give him a pleasant companionship. He had me. You don't know what we were to each other, at least what he was to me," she added humbly. "Still," said Roger, "he must have thought it for the best, or he wouldn't have done it. He may have thought it the best for your sake, even more than his own. Well, that's what he tried to convince me of." Roger began to kick a pebble. He had not got hold of the right end of the clue. Suddenly he looked up. "I want to tell you of a girl I know." This was not included in the movie. "Her mother died when she was about 16, the eldest of a large family. From that time, all through the bloom of her youth, she gave herself up to her father, first as his comforter, afterwards his companion, friend, secretary, anything you like. He was a man with a great deal of business on his hands, and often came home only to set to afresh new preparations for the next day's work. Harriet was always there, ready to help, to talk, or to be silent. It went on for 8 or 10 more years that way, and then her father married again, a woman not many years older than Harriet herself. Well, they are just the happiest set of people I know. You wouldn't have thought it likely, would you?" She was listening, but she had no heart to say anything. Yet she was interested in this little story of Harriet, a girl who had been so much to her own father, more than Molly, in this early youth of hers. How was it? She sighed at last. Well, Harriet thought her father's happiness before she thought of her own, Roger answered, with something of severe brevity. Molly needed the bracing. She began to cry a little. If it were for Papa's happiness, he must believe that it is. Whether you fancy, give him a chance, he cannot have much comfort, I would think, if he sees you fretting or pining, you who have been so much to him. The lady herself, too, if Harriet's stepmother had been a selfish woman, and had always been clutching after her own wishes, but she was not. She was as anxious for Harriet to be happy as she was for her father, and your father's future wife might be another of the same kind, though such people are rare. So, I'll read some more to you another time. I've already sat here for an hour, and I hope that you got something done. I don't want to read the whole book. I just want to read a couple of more passages from it and move on to something else. And so, in the meantime, I hope that you got something sorted, folded, loaded, unloaded, and that you feel energized, and that you dressed, and that you observe your home as something very, very important, and that you will not listen to bad news. And I was going to tell you something more about literature. If you base it on some categories that you work out yourself. Now, I've suggested using Philippians 4:8 and asking the question about the story. Is it good? Is it lovely? Does it have a good reputation? And is it virtuous? Because stories like this, the author wanted everyone to end up happily ever after. And unfortunately, many of us that were growing up in the 1950s went to public school and had stories we read which were not exactly inspiring or good. What we want to do is have a category and a standard to judge these stories. So whether they're considered classics or not, you make up your own mind, and don't trust everything just because it's a classic. So ladies, I hope that you have a lovely day and that you get a lot done, and I'll see you next time. Bye.